Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And now, here are your hosts, Scott and Jesse from CompassKnox.com.
Hello and welcome back again to Compass Points, the weekly podcast where we talk about Knoxville politics, government, news, education, business, anything that gets our attention. I am Jesse Mayshark, co-publisher and co-founder of Compass at CompassKnox.com, joined as always by Scott Barker, co-publisher and co-founder of Compass. How are you doing today, Scott?
I am doing well. The spring break is over, and so we'll be getting back to normal next week.
No more wet T-shirt contest for you?
No more. No. The big problem for me was everybody's gone.
Yeah.
Everybody takes off on spring break, so about half my sources were out of town. So
yeah.
It was a difficult time.
Is this something that's become more true? I've been trying to think about this. Like, I feel like spring break for kids for grade school or UT or whatever used to be something mostly concentrated on the kids and people who had kids, and now I kind of feel like it's become almost a universal holiday. Like everybody just leaves.
Yeah, I think it's an added holiday period for a lot of people, and
because you kind of know nothing important is probably going to happen in your workplace, especially if you work in the public sector.
Yeah, and, because even if you don't have kids, other people in your wherever you work have kids, and they're going to be gone, and so you're going to be short-staffed, and so you're not going to plan as much stuff for that week.
Yeah,
and it's just and it's very. I get the sense it's pretty different. I don't remember even having spring break per se in the school system where I grew up.
Where you were walking uphill to school 5 miles a day and everything?
Well, only when it snowed.
Right.
But but I don't remember. I remember us having a long weekend for Easter, but I don't recall. It might be a bad memory on my part, but I don't recall that. Now, I was speaking with my wife, and she said that she had spring break in Knox County schools when she was growing up. But I didn't grow up in Knox County, and so I don't recall us having it.
Yeah, you were out in the great county of. You were in Kingston, right?
I was in Kingston. Yeah. Yes, Roane County High School.
All right. Well, who was busy this week? While most people were not busy, the Tennessee State Legislature was very busy this week because spring break arrives right in the heart of their legislative session. They do not take any time off. They do not slow down, and we're going to be talking about them a lot today because that's where a lot of this week's actual news action was. Also coming up, we have an interview with Rick Emmett, who is the soon-to-retire downtown coordinator for the city of Knoxville, and just kind of talk to him about his experience there, changes he's seen downtown, the kind of little things that it takes to keep a complex ecosystem, if we can use that word, like downtown operating. And we're also going to talk about a significant anniversary we had this week of a little thing called COVID. But let's start off in Nashville, in the state legislature. And we talked last week a fair amount about Lieutenant Governor Randy McNally. In fact, we've talked about this the last 2 weeks. And we're going to talk about it for a third week
Yes.
because this story has not quite completely settled down yet. In this past, so since we recorded last Friday, Lieutenant Governor McNally, first of all, achieved a distinction of sorts. He is the first that I'm aware of member of the Knox County Legislative Delegation to be personally impersonated. Where, Scott?
On Saturday Night Live.
Saturday Night Live Weekend Update. They actually had, and it was cast member Molly Kearney playing Lieutenant Governor Randy McNally, which, first of all, they're very funny. Secondly, Kearney is the first non-binary cast member that Saturday Night Live has ever had. And so there's kind of a little bit of added something there, irony, or I don't know what you call it, in having Kearney play Lieutenant Governor McNally right after our state, of course, has passed restriction on drag shows, and also in the context of talking about Lieutenant Governor McNally's social media habits and the fact that he apparently likes, in the literal clicking and liking and commenting sense of photos of young, attractive queer people. People over the age of 18, we should say. Now, there have been some allegations, and this is part of what has happened over the course of this past week, that, he maybe liked some of these photos by some people when they were actually under the age of 18. We did have one state representative, Todd Warner, came out toward the end of the week basically calling for McNally to step down from his leadership role and making allegations that he had in fact liked some photos of somebody who was younger and using the G word. What's the G word? Groomer.
Yeah.
Well, gay, sure, but groomer is really the word that has become a sort of all-purpose insult in some segments of the American right, especially the online right, especially on Twitter and places like that. Kind of anybody you disagree with is a groomer. You kind of find a way to, whatever their position is, whether it's on climate change or, critical race theory or whatever, you always find a way to say, and also they're a groomer. And of course, groomer is a concept that has an actual basis. It's a pattern of, trying to literally groom somebody to do something that you want them to. We often use it in the cases of child molesters in particular, but it really has become just this like all-purpose insult. I mean, I've been called a groomer online by people who I don't even know and who don't know anything about me. It's just kind of like the default online insult. So now we've had a state rep throw that word at Lieutenant Governor McNally. However, so far, it kind of seems like the people who have made the most noise about McNally are very kind of fringy types within the Republican Party, right?
Yeah. It really the mainstream leadership of the party has been pretty silent for the most part on this.
Seems like they kind of want it to go away.
Yeah, they would like it to go away. They figure if they're not going to throw any more gasoline on the fire. Now they may be talking, behind the scenes,
right?
But at least publicly, the leadership is not saying a whole lot. And of course, one of the things is Randy McNally is one of the most powerful people in Nashville.
Right.
I mean, he is the lieutenant governor. People, when he says jump, they say how high. He's really. He's really got some power, so it takes some guts to speak up to him, or foolishness, one of the two.
Right. Yeah. If you sense that there may be a change, your more cautious politicians will kind of sit back and wait to see what that change is going to be before you declare an allegiance to something that you might end up having to answer for later, basically.
That is certainly true.
So I guess we'll see what happens there. I mean, it seems to me, of course, there may be, as they say, more to come out. There are things that could come out potentially that you would think, well, yeah, that might be a case where he would have to step down. But at the moment, it feels kind of unlikely that anybody's going to try to force a change while we're in the middle of a session. Once they adjourn, of course, this is only the first year of their 2-year assembly. But once they adjourn, there could be space. Maybe there will be some conversations there with some people about whether McNally wants to, he is 79, whether he wants to complete the term he was just elected to. I don't know. We'll see what happens there. I think one thing, leaving aside kind of all of the titillating aspects of this story from an East Tennessee perspective, what people should probably keep in mind is that Randy McNally is by far the highest ranking East Tennessean in the legislature. And, we used to have more high-ranking Republicans from East Tennessee, but as more of the state has become more Republican, now we have Republicans from all over, because East Tennessee used to be sort of where the Republicans in Tennessee were, really.
That's true.
And so now we have Republicans kind of everywhere, except in the major cities, basically, coming out of in the legislature. And the power base in the state Republican Party has very much already moved from East Tennessee, where it was for many decades, to Middle Tennessee, to Williamson County specifically, where Governor Bill Lee is from, where Jack Johnson, who is the Senate Majority Leader, is from. If Randy McNally were to, vacate that leadership position, Jack Johnson is the most likely person to step up into it. And Marsha Blackburn is from Williamson County. So really the center of political power in Tennessee has already moved to Middle Tennessee. If and when Randy McNally is no longer lieutenant governor, and let's say he serves out the rest of his term, I mean, it's hard to imagine him staying for too long, he will probably be the end of that kind of East Tennessee power base in the legislature.
I agree. 30 years ago, you're right, it was still, East Tennessee was home of the Republican Party in Tennessee. West Tennessee and the legislature was Democratic.
Yep.
And Middle and West Tennessee were that's where Democrats
And this
were.
was old school Southern Democrats, we should say.
Yeah, and so one thing is in those days, East Tennesseans thought we got shortchanged on a lot of things. Road projects went to West Tennessee and Middle Tennessee, not to East Tennessee. That changed somewhat. We had a couple of East Tennesseans as governor, and then the Republicans, got control of the legislature. But now, as you said, most of the leadership is concentrated in Middle Tennessee, and I don't see that shifting.
Yeah, well, it's because it's where the biggest population is, and it's also, where the state's economy is very much anchored. Although, of course, East Tennessee is very important. We love East Tennessee, but East Tennessee's relative place in the legislative cosmos is in the process of shifting. If and when Randy McNally is no longer serving in that role, I think that it might be a while before we see another East Tennessean in those kind of leadership roles in the legislature. Of course, we do have Senators Massey and Briggs, who are both relatively senior. They've been there 2 to 3 terms each, and they're both chairs of some powerful committees. So it's not that we will lack for voices there. But I know from my time working at the city of Knoxville, I happened to overlap with when former Governor Bill Haslam was governor. And anybody who tells you that it's not an advantage to have the governor be from your part of the state is just wrong. is probably deliberately misleading you. Governors will tell you, oh, of course, we care about the whole state. And they do, sure, of course. But, in my case, my former boss, Mayor Madeline Rojero, had worked for Governor Haslam when he was mayor of Knoxville. She already had his phone number. It was not hard for her to just call him directly without dealing with layers of bureaucracy and everything else. And so just having that kind of access to state government, it makes a big difference. And East Tennessee has been in a period of enjoying that to some degree, and I think that we're probably going to be eclipsed a little bit here, regardless of what happens in the short term with McNally. Okay, let's talk about some things the legislature actually did. We wrote about this past week the third grade retention law, which we have talked about here before. Basically, the way the law is set up right now, this law was just passed a couple of years ago, and it's just coming into effect this year. Third grade students under the law will be judged solely on their annual TCAP reading test, which they have to take every April. And the way the law is written, anybody who doesn't score proficient on that test is subject to being held back for a year in third grade. If they're not held back for a year in third grade, they have to do mandatory summer camps, basically, and be retested and have intensive tutoring in fourth grade. And then, if they still don't score proficient on the fourth grade TCAP, they'll be held back in fourth grade. So the problem with this, as we've talked about, is that that test is actually, it's a rigorous test. It doesn't just measure whether kids can read, it measures their sort of ability to engage with material at an advanced reading comprehension level. And only 40% of Knox County third graders actually score proficient every year. So you're talking about 60% who don't. Of course, school boards across the state, including Knox County's, passed resolutions asking the state to please change this. Really, ideally, what they would like to see is for that portion of the law also provided these extra supports. It provided supports for these summer programs and for tutoring, and school systems think those are valuable. Sure, provide more resources to help kids who need it, but this specific decision about whether to hold kids back or not, which right now very few kids are held back, they would prefer, the local districts would prefer that remain a local decision made by teachers, principals, parents, as it is right now. And part of the argument there, and Superintendent John Ryswick here in Knox County has said this a few times, there really isn't any data to show that holding kids back improves their long-term academic progress. And there is also some kind of counter data that it has other bad effects socially. They're more likely to be bullied or to be bullies. Did you have any kids in your elementary school class who had been held back?
Had a couple who were held back, and yeah, it was difficult for them socially.
Yeah, I remember we had, I think, just one kid in my grade school who everybody knew had been held back a year. And he was the oldest kid in the class, and he was the biggest kid in the class by some measure because he was a year older than most of us. Super nice guy. I don't know whatever happened to him. I hope he's doing well. But we were all aware of it. He was aware of it, and there is this kind of social stigma that can very much come. Now that may change if like half the class is being held back. I don't know. That could change that dynamic. Nevertheless, there were a lot of objections to this law, and initially a lot of state legislators said, "We hear you. We're going to change it. Yes, we're going to do something about this." Well, there were lots of proposals, including proposals to basically just return that control back to the local districts. I think there were like 15 bills that were proposed, and these came through a key education subcommittee this week in the House. All of those bills essentially were pushed aside, and a last-minute bill was substituted in, proposed by Representative Mark White, who is the very powerful chair of the House Education Administration Committee. And this bill makes some changes. Currently, kind of where that bar is set, to score proficient, you need to be at the 65th percentile nationally, and these are nationally normed tests. And so literally you would have to score in the top third of all students nationally just to move from third to fourth grade. So what this bill does is it lowers that threshold down to the 50th percentile. You have to score in the top half. Well, like statistically, how many kids can score in the top half? And it's nationally normed, so theoretically more Tennessee kids could score, more than 50% could score above that, but still, it's probably not going to be tremendously more. No. Tennessee students are not going to be reading on some massively advanced level to the rest of the country. So it's still leaving about, say, up to half of third and fourth graders facing this. And it added in one other test that could be used, like if you don't do well enough on the TCAP, if you score over 50% on this other benchmark test, then you could. But again, that's just one more state test, and it still basically leaves this decision at the state level. It encodes it in state law, there would be an appeal process, but basically for parents, and especially since this is supposed to take effect this year, if you're a parent in Knox County right now and you have a student in 3rd grade, you don't know if your kid's going on to 4th grade. They haven't even taken the test yet that decision is going to be based on. Good luck making summer plans.
Really?
You know, if your kid's going to have to go to some mandatory summer camp. So at the moment, it's still kind of, now this bill is still moving through. There's the potential for further changes, but it seems like this is the bill that kind of the Republican leadership has settled on as a way to address at least some of these concerns.
Yeah, and one of the things about this is illustrates something that we've talked about before, and that is the power of committee chairs in the legislature.
Yep.
Can wipe out all these other bills, regardless of their merits, and put their bill, the one they want to put in, and move that forward.
Yep,
So.
and that's very much how the system works. And, you know, they're not usually acting unilaterally. They're usually acting in consultation with the governor, with various interest groups. You know, there's a lot of different sort of vectors of influence in Nashville, but right, sometimes people, you know, I feel like these are the parts that got left out of that old how a bill becomes a law, you know, video, because it's not just that, oh, somebody writes a bill and proposes it and then they debate it on the merits, and then no. I mean, what really matters, if you want to look at bills that are likely to get through the state legislature, the very first thing you look at is who's proposing it,
right?
And whose committee does it have to go through? You know, what is its actual path to being passed? Because that makes a huge difference. So we'll continue to cover that issue. But if you are a parent of a 3rd grade student this year, you know, buckle up.
Good luck planning the summer. So.
Right. Another bill that we have talked about here before that we thought had kind of been sidelined for the year came back to life this week, and this is something that also happens in the legislature, and that has to do with Knoxville elections. So, Scott, what's going on with that bill?
Yeah, it was left for dead last week, but you know, like our zombie movie, it's coming back. This is a bill that Elaine Davis, who is a freshman member of the House from Knox County, and she proposed a bill that would change the way Knoxville and Morristown do their elections. Currently in Knoxville, for the district seats, the district voters vote for in the primary. The top 2 finishers then go on to a general election, but the general election is selected. The winner is selected by voters citywide, so not just those people who live in that district. So that's the way it has been for at least 40 years, at least 50 years.
Yeah, I think 1969 is the first time that it came into effect.
That's the year that I keep hearing. It's, you know, I was 4 years old and didn't live in Knox County at that time. But anyway, Davis is this is allowed because of an exception to state law. State law for everybody else, you know, says that a district only race has to be done not only in the primary but in the general election as well. The Davis's bill would eliminate that exception. So, and that would force Knoxville to change how it elects district representatives. It wouldn't affect at-large representatives. Just
they already run citywide anyway.
Yeah, they already run citywide. So, anyway, it easily passed in the House, 72-20 vote in the House, mostly along party lines. Though a couple of Democrats voted for it, most Democrats voted against it. No Republicans voted against it, so it sailed on its merry way. In the Senate, however, it was being carried by Senator Richard Briggs from Knox County, and he wasn't thrilled with the idea of the state legislature telling the city of Knoxville what to do. And as far as their election goes, if they can, as long as it was constitutional, he wanted to make sure that he wanted to be satisfied that it was a constitutional system that was set up. He was okay with it, the city elections the way they were. And in fact, he basically lodged it in the subcommittee where bills go to die.
Right.
Yeah,
there's lots of different ways for the legislature to mothball bills. They can assign them to a general subcommittee, which is what he did. They can send them to something they call summer study, which is something that happens a lot. But basically, sometimes they'll put things behind the budget, which means maybe they'll get to it at the end of the year. But all of those are ways of basically just kind of pushing a bill aside, at least for that session.
Yeah, without going through the whole voting thing.
Right.
Who wants to vote? Anyway, so it was there. So its prospects for passage this year were seemingly dead. But then, all the machinations behind this aren't clear, but Senator Frank Nicely, who's from Strawberry Plains, just across the county line from
not
Knox
in Knox County.
Not the Strawberry Plains area of East Knox County, but on the other side of the county line, and he took sponsorship of the bill. He had to do that with Briggs's blessing, and Briggs apparently wasn't comfortable enough with it to carry it himself, but he allowed Nicely to carry it, and now it's going to go back. It's back in the pipeline. Going to go through the legislative process. Now it does have to. Its first hurdle is Briggs's Education Committee. So we'll
state and local government.
State and local government committee.
Yep.
And so that'll be an interesting. That should come up this week. It's not on the agenda yet, but. It was only resurrected a couple of days ago. So Knoxville's election process could change. It would affect, assuming it goes into, the law would go into effect this year, as soon as the governor signed it, if it passes. It would only affect one race. It's the 5th District Council race this year. Charles Thomas is the representative there. He's planning to run for a second term, and don't know if anybody's running against him. They hadn't cleared yet. So if that happens, he and whoever he runs against will face each other in the primary and in the general election, with voters in the district being the only ones who can vote for them. It doesn't really affect the other district council members, because they're all in their second terms. Tommy Smith is he's
in his first and a half term.
First and a half term, yeah, he'll serve 1.5 terms, and the partial terms count toward term limits in the city of Knoxville. So it won't affect them. It will affect their races, 4 years from now.
Right, when those 5 seats all come up.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's a lot of questions there. One is that this election mechanism that we have, which is unusual and is a little bit hard to explain to people when you start talking through it, but it's in the city charter. And so you would have to, for the city of Knoxville to change this system itself, it would require a referendum of city voters to do it.
Right.
Of course, if state law passes, that would supersede that. But I still wonder if there wouldn't be some requirement for there to be, they would have to bring the charter somehow into compliance with state law. And I think it would raise some interesting questions too about how you would run the primaries then, because let's say you only have 2 candidates in a district, and both the primary and the general election are going to be held in that district. If it's still set up so that the top 2 finishers go on from the primary to the general, does that mean you literally run the same election twice in the same district? Like that seems odd. Well,
the answer is yes. Well, we already do that.
But the answer is not yes, because that's not actually written down anywhere. This state law, like if they pass this law, it doesn't specify how they would have to run the primary and the general. It just says that they would have to both be in the district. Presumably, if the city wanted to, they could pass something like they have with the mayor's race, where if you get over 50% in the primary, you don't have to go on to the general.
They may do that, but I think as a practical matter, they probably won't. And one reason, we already do this for the at-large seats.
Yeah, it's true. That's been talked about. There's been proposals to change that in the past, too.
Yeah, they could change it. I think that would require a charter change.
Yeah.
For sure. I think if this law passes, the election commission and would have no choice but to go ahead and do a primary and a general.
Oh, I agree as written, but I also think that it would, either way, I feel like it's going to require some change to the city charter.
Yeah. They would want to change the charter either way. If the bill does pass, it does go into law, they will want to change the charter just to make it comply with state law. And
then they could look at how they want to do the primary, because, of course, primaries are mostly set up for party races, and these races are nonpartisan. So when you have partisan races, you don't have the situation of literally running the same election twice. But in nonpartisan races, and as you say, the city already does this in its at-large seats. If you only have two candidates, you literally do run that election twice, which is it's unusual.
Hey, sorry guys, as a city charter amendment, is it got to go to an election? Like it would have to be on the ballot that the city residents would vote on it?
Yeah, and that couldn't happen until next year at the earliest.
So what happens if the city doesn't pass it, even though it's obligated by state law?
Well, I think that this year, as Scott's saying, the state law would control, basically. I suppose the city could file a lawsuit to try to block it if they wanted to. But if you assume that it just goes into effect, they would have to run it, that 5th district race, as a district primary and a district general. And because the charter does say that the top two finishers go on from the primary to the general, you would go with the charter as much as you could, but you would still have to abide by state law.
Right, but next time around when they actually put the charter amendment on the ballot and the city just is like, no, we don't want to change this, even though you have to. What would be the reaction if the city overwhelmingly says, no, we want to keep it the way it is?
I'm not sure. I don't think that would have any effect, but
they still would have to follow state law.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line, is that they would have to conduct, no matter what the charter says, they've got to follow the state law.
Right. So they'd follow the state law and keep it as close to the current charter, even though it's not quite correct state law-wise.
Well, and so there are some other issues, because Knoxville is a home rule city. It has a home rule charter, which typically gives it a little more control over its own governmental mechanisms. And if they were going to contest this legally, that's probably what they would claim. But I have no idea if the city would feel like that was a good use of their legal resources to do that.
Okay. Like I said, just curious. Thanks.
So basically, we don't know what's going to happen with this. The fact that Nicely, in general, a bill sponsored by Frank Nicely is not one that you would necessarily look at and say, oh, that's definitely going to pass, because he is one of these, he's an independent thinker, let's say.
Yes,
he's
absolutely.
on kind of like the hard libertarian and the hard rural agricultural libertarian end of the party. He has a tendency to propose bills that do not, in fact, go anywhere. Mm-hmm. And so had this bill started as a Nicely bill, you might have thought, well, this doesn't necessarily have a lot of traction. But it seems like it's still going to, a lot of this is still going to hinge on what Senator Briggs thinks of it, I'm guessing.
Yeah, well, as the committee chair, definitely will. And, and one thing is, it's interesting, the Republican leadership, which we've been talking about, has kind of stayed out of it because they're all from Middle Tennessee, and this only, as far as we know, only affects 2 East Tennessee cities, and so they're kind of staying out of it. It'll be interesting to see, when push comes to shove in the Senate, how they vote. Now, House leadership voted for it. They were fine with it. But I don't know. I mean, you did have a person who represents at least a portion of the city of Knoxville pushing it in the House. Frank Nicely is not even from Knox County, much less the city of Knoxville. So that could play into it. But also, on the other side of the coin is this legislature has no qualms about telling cities what to do.
Yeah.
There's several bills, and some have passed, preempting Nashville's.
Right. Just this past week, they passed, and the governor signed that bill, slashing the Nashville Metro Council from 40 members to 20 members. Yeah. So it's literally going to put 20. Now, Nashville is going to contest that legally.
Yes.
We'll find out how that goes, but they're literally going to put half of Nashville's council members out of office.
Oh, yeah, really.
And that is perceived very much as a retaliation against Metro Council for not wanting to invite the Republican National Committee to hold their 2024 convention in Nashville.
Right.
And I think, like, on the Knoxville city side, you can also certainly see this push as a partisan move because it is being, it was proposed by Representative Elaine Davis. Her campaign manager / legal guru is Eric Wyatter, who, as we have talked about, ran a slate of city council candidates, all Republicans, 2 years ago, and they all lost, including in the 3rd district, which is the most Republican district in the city. Definitely one impact of this bill, if it passes, one practical political impact will be that it will be easier for Republicans to get elected in 1 or 2 districts than it currently is, because right now the overall city tilts Democratic. So regardless of the makeup of any individual district, when you come to those citywide elections, you're always running with a kind of progressive leaning electorate overall. And so there is some partisan, there's some clear partisan advantage to the bill. On the other hand, you can very much frame it, and Davis certainly has, as a philosophical argument that, you know, if you have a district representative, they should be elected by the people in the district, which, you know, certainly has a persuasive.
Yeah, it's pretty logical, you know.
It is how we run literally our school board district races are elected within the district, our county commission district's the same, and also every other city in the state, apart from Morristown, as you mentioned, that has district representatives, including Nashville with its 40. Some of those are at large. I don't know exactly how many districts they have. But all of those district seats, every place else in the state, are elected within the district. So it is certainly not a crazy argument to say that, well, you know, district reps should be voted on by people who live in the district.
Yeah, it's not crazy at all. And I think that it was evident when it came up in the House that people from other parts of the state were very perplexed at the way the system is. Now, Davis left out a couple of things telling them how it operates, but they just, it was difficult for them to wrap their brains around
why you would
the
do
idea
this.
that voters across the city would elect one small district's representative, because then you've got. It's happened here where the person who went, it's happened in the 3rd district at least 3 times.
Yep.
In the last 30 years, that somebody will win or be the top vote getter in the primary, move on to the general election, and voters citywide will flip it.
Right,
and
pick the second place person,
Yeah.
and so the district voters' first choice does not end up being their actual representative.
Right. Yeah.
So we will continue to follow that. As you say, this issue of city preemption, it's not a new issue. It's something that's been going on in various realms, for example, gun control, for years. But this legislature seems very aggressive in their willingness to use state power to override local decision making. They are focused primarily on Nashville right now, but kind of that willingness could easily be applied to any other city. In Nashville, besides the Metro Council bill, there are also proposals for the state to either take over or exert some level of influence in the Metro Nashville Airport Authority. Knoxville also has a Metro Airport Authority, so if that happens in Nashville, it could happen here.
Very easily.
They are looking at having some kind of state control over the whole stadium area district there in Nashville, where they're looking to spend $500 million in state funds and so forth. And also, interestingly, a proposal for the state to take over liquor license controls specifically for the Lower Broadway tourist district there in Nashville, which I think has its roots in some fights that happened during the pandemic between city government, Nashville Metro government, and bar owners over things like mask regulations and hour regulations and so forth. And so it's a rare case where you have the state kind of wanting to take control of bars, and a lot of the bar owners in particular, there's one group, Tootsie's, that owns like half of the big honky-tonks and everything down there. They would prefer to deal with what they perceive, at the moment anyway, as a friendlier state government than the city government. Of course, those are kind of dangerous things because just because you like the state government now, you give them a bunch of power. If that state government, the tenor and makeup of that state government changes in 10 or 15 years, they're still going to have that same power. So these things can have unintended consequences. But what it all adds up to, I think, is just a picture where, to the degree that we continue to have more progressive city governments and a very kind of conservative, hard right state government, we're going to see increasing conflicts. And when it comes to those conflicts, the state has most of the power.
Absolutely.
All right. Another area that the legislature is active in is in its relationship with the federal government. So we've talked about them kind of overriding city and local control. Of course, what can override state authority? Federal authority.
Federal government, yes.
And our current legislature doesn't necessarily like that. And so they've taken several steps over the years, and it seems like it's becoming a recurrent theme, to divorce themselves from federal control as much as possible in different areas. So for one thing, of course, we have never expanded our Medicaid program under the Americans with Disabilities Act. We remain one of about a dozen states that hasn't done that. We have turned down literal billions of dollars over the past 12 years or so in federal funding that would have gone to provide federal Medicaid insurance for working poor people in Tennessee, basically. There's all sorts of people who would qualify, hundreds of thousands of Tennesseans who would qualify for that coverage, and there's federal funding available to provide it, and we have just said, no, we're not going to take it. So that kind of set a precedent for the state being willing to literally turn down federal funds that could help like actual Tennesseans living here, just because they don't ideologically like the design of the program. More recently, we've talked about the state wanting to turn down federal HIV prevention and testing funding. And now that same subcommittee in education that passed the modified third grade retention law this week also approved the formation of a task force that House Speaker Cameron Sexton wants to set up to study whether Tennessee should give up federal education funding entirely. The number that I've seen is the state currently receives about $1.8 billion in education funding. That makes up roughly a quarter or so of our overall, state, the funding that comes to local districts through the state. It's a lot of money, big chunk of change. And Sexton's argument is that the state right now is very flush with cash, which is true. You could say, well, maybe there's other things they could look at to spend that on than finding federal programs they can give up and make up with state cash. For example, we know there are a lot of problems with our Department of Children's Services.
I was about to bring that up.
Yeah.
I know we're going to talk about it later. But
we are, yeah. The idea here is that by refusing federal funding, the state could get out of some undetermined number of federal regulations. Sexton has not been very specific about which federal regulations he's trying to get away from. The state already has a lot of education control. It controls the curriculum. It would probably get them out of some federal testing requirements. It's possible it would get them out of compliance with certain federal laws, like the individuals, what they call IDEA, the kind of Federal Disability Act. Although those are really kind of civil rights laws that have to do with the rights of disabled students. And so just because you turn down federal funding that goes to support disabled students, I don't think necessarily means that you get out of total compliance with what really is a civil rights law. And that's the thing that people who have concerns about this idea have pointed out, is that the majority, the biggest chunk of that federal money really goes to students with disabilities. It goes to low-income students at schools across the state. That's where the biggest bulk of this federal money goes to support the most vulnerable students with specific identified needs, various kinds of disadvantages. And so for the state to say, well, don't worry, we'll make it up, advocates for those various groups say, well, what do you mean? Because what you're really talking about is setting up an entirely new state program that you say is going to do these same things, but will it really? If you're going to spend that much money, are you really going to focus it on, say, low-income students, or are there going to be political pressures to say, well, let's spread it around to everybody? All of those things come into play when the legislature is setting up its own programs. So we don't know where this will go. The idea is to set up a task force that'll take, I think, 2 years. Now, Knoxville State Rep Sam McKenzie, who was, I think, the only Democratic member on that subcommittee, he raised objections to this. And he basically said, why are we doing this? Like, what is the indication that the federal funding we're getting, or the federal programs or requirements, that there's actually a problem there that needs to be solved? And the sponsors of the bill just kind of said, well, that's why we're setting up the task force, because we want to study it. And McKenzie's response was, well, this is an 11-member task force that's being set up. It has 2 teachers on it statewide, 2 school administrators, and then everybody else who's on it are members of the legislature or the commissioner of education, which of course is a kind of inherently political position. And so what McKenzie said was, you're setting up a committee with 4 educators and 7 politicians. How do you think it's going to turn out? We'll see.
Well, and one thing, I mean, this is unprecedented as far as I don't know of any state that's ever turned down federal education funding. And so you mentioned, can you even do this?
Right.
We don't know, because nobody's ever tried to do this.
Yeah.
So it will be interesting to see what this task force comes up with. Things can change a lot in 2 years. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's possible that the math just doesn't add up no matter who's on the task force. Because when you think about trying to make up say $2 billion a year from now till forever, is that really something the state can sustain? Yes, we do have a huge kind of state fund balance right now, but obviously that's something that can change. If we really do go into a serious recession, which is still kind of one of those looming questions, is that going to seem like a good time to turn down whatever money is out there? As you say, 2 years is a long time. A lot of this, you could argue, is a certain amount of political posturing vis-a-vis the state government versus the federal government, not least because the federal government right now is run by Democrats, especially the executive branch where the Department of Education is. And so, is this just kind of saber rattling and fist shaking at a federal administration you don't like? All of those things are possible. We will see. The one other bill, tons of things happened in the legislature this week. We're not going to cover all of them, but the one other bill I wanted to mention, because we've talked about proposals to change our abortion ban, which have been opposed by Tennessee Right to Life and anti-abortion advocates. This week, Tennessee Right to Life actually came out and endorsed one of those bills, which is a much narrower bill than others that had been proposed by State Senator Ken Yeager. And it basically takes, we've talked about the affirmative defense in state law, that it's illegal for a doctor to perform an abortion under any circumstance. However, if they do it under a circumstance where it's to save the life of the mother, or prevent serious permanent injury. There's this thing called an affirmative defense, where if they are charged in that case, they can use that as a defense.
Right.
Now, doctors have said that that's still really not much use. Like, you're still, at that point, you've been arrested, you've been criminally charged. The fact that you have a defense, that it still was making it very hard for doctors to know what they were legally allowed to do. So this bill would be a little more clear about that, and instead of saying that this would be an affirmative defense, it would just be an exception. It would say that to save the life of the mother or to prevent serious permanent injury, a doctor could terminate a pregnancy under those circumstances, period. It's not an affirmative defense, it's just an exception to the law. But of course, that would leave a lot of questions. There's still going to be some level of judgment there about when is somebody's life in danger? When are they in danger of permanent harm? What does that even mean? And you're still looking at doctors making these decisions under what are probably fairly stressful circumstances. Nevertheless, that is the bill that Tennessee Right to Life has supported, and because of that, it did pass out of a committee this week. It looks like if there's going to be any change to the abortion law this year, that's the one that is most likely to happen. Which then they will be able to say that there is an exception. Right now, they've kind of tried to argue that the affirmative defense is an exception, and it really isn't.
It's not, no.
So this would actually create an exception, but a very, very narrow one, which of course is the only kind of exception that Tennessee Right to Life is going to want. Probably that is not going to satisfy a lot of people who object to the abortion ban more broadly. Okay, so let's turn away from the legislature for now. We're actually going to talk about state government a little bit more a little later. But another thing happened this past week, Scott, and what was that? This was an anniversary week.
Yes, last Sunday, March 12th, was the third anniversary of the first confirmed case of COVID-19 in Knox County. It was March 12th, 2020, when the first confirmation that the pandemic was here, and obviously it triggered a lot of changes that some are still around, but what we thought we'd do is take a look back through the 3 years at just there's so much you could cover on this, but what we did is kind of narrowed it down to the public health angle of the story, and just take a look at the numbers of the from the pandemic and kind of how it's played out, primarily in the health standpoint. We have to, you can't talk about it without mentioning some of the other political things, but we didn't focus on the political. We focused on the health. And it's interesting. You look back at all of the data for the past 3 years, and it's really a kind of a story of these three big surges divided by these lulls of where everything almost seems normal, and but the numbers are pretty staggering. 1,599 Knox County residents have died
Through March 12th.
March 12th. And the one interesting thing that popped up that I hadn't really put together, but I mean, nearly half of the deaths, those 1,600 deaths, nearly half of them came during just those surges, just those 4 or 5 months together. You pull them all together, it's about 5 months of surge activity. And
that was kind of the winter of 2021.
Right.
And then the fall of 21.
The winter of 2021, fall of 2021, and January of 2022.
Or as we may say, the OG COVID, the Delta wave, and the Omicron wave.
Yeah, and the Omicron wave. This was an interesting thing. Once the vaccines became available in December of 2020, so 2021 was when I think most people got vaccinated. And about 57% of the population, it's about 281,000 people in Knox County got vaccinated that year. And then right at the beginning of the new year, we had this Omicron wave because Omicron could evade the vaccine. So, but anyway.
But I do think something notable, because I know there's a lot of talk out there about the effectiveness of vaccines and so forth. In the Omicron wave, we had way more cases. That was when we had the most cases. That was the biggest surge of any of them. But we we actually had fewer deaths during that wave than we did during like the original wave.
Yes.
Before anyone was vaccinated.
Yes, the original wave, the one from the winter of 2020, 2021, was the deadliest wave. Omicron was the biggest. There were 8 days during the Omicron wave that we had more than 1,000 cases, new cases detected, and by far it lasted longer than the other surges, affected far more people than the other surges, but as you said, wasn't nearly as deadly. But we took a look at those numbers. And we talked to Carol Myers. She's a UT nursing professor who is an expert in public health policy. And we talked a little bit about things because she's really concerned because first of all, COVID's not gone. I mean, we're acting like it's gone. I mean, when you go to the store now, you rarely see anyone in a mask. No social distancing whatsoever.
Yes, including myself. I would say I don't wear a mask out. I'm not social distancing. I am, like probably all of us here, mostly acting like it's 2019.
Yes. And
now I am vaccinated and also I've had COVID.
But Myers is concerned that because it's still here, and because it's a global pandemic and it can mutate further, that concern that we could get a resurgence in a stronger, stronger version of COVID. So, and one of the things is this has really had some negative effects on the perception of public health because of the fights over mask mandates and vaccines.
Right. It became a political issue as much or more than a health issue.
It did, and a lot of people in public health have left. So there's a big brain drain in public health sector. Martha Buchanan, who was the director of the Knox County Health Department, went in and retired.
Which she didn't say was because of all of the pressure and conflicts with the with Mayor Jacobs' office, but I think a lot of us assume that it was a difficult time to be the Knox County Health Director.
It certainly was, and she said she was ready to retire and all that, but you can't help but wonder about the timing. And then, and also the impacts on the healthcare delivery system, as opposed to just the public health, managing these kinds of diseases. But the hospitals, the nursing shortage are acute now. There was already a shortage before COVID, but as when COVID hit, the stress and the strain that it put on healthcare workers, particularly nurses, since they carry so much of the burden of delivering care, and many were leaving.
Right.
And so,
and we're seeing the effects of that in things like last week we were talking about how our ambulances are having to wait so long in emergency rooms.
Right.
There's lots of reasons for that, but one of the reasons is staffing shortages in hospitals.
Absolutely, and the one thing that Myers brought up was that really COVID showed, just presented the undeniable disparities in healthcare across the country, with the people who are low income, who are members of minority groups. These people, especially the uninsured, they were hit very hard by this. In Knox County, the African American population contracted COVID at a much higher rate than the white population did, and that's despite some heroic efforts to try to get the population vaccinated, and I know a lot of the leadership in the African American community really took the mask mandate seriously, and a lot of African Americans, it seemed like they embraced the masks more than the white population did.
I will say that I think without exception, every or just about every anti-mask speaker who I saw at the many public forums at County Commission and School Board where people came and spoke about this, every single one of them was white. And to the degree that former school board member Ebony Satterfield, who at the time was the only black member of the school board, actually kind of called them out on it at one point. And, she said in her view it was a mark of white privilege to treat masks like they were the biggest problem the community was facing, when in her view, her community was dealing with a lot of other issues that she thought were more important. So there was always this kind of sense of, there was a bit of a racial difference here locally, at least at the leadership level, in how people responded to this.
Yeah, and and that's if those, Myers's point is if those disparities aren't addressed, then the next pandemic or the next wave of COVID-19, whatever, will be just as bad. That those things need to be fixed. I know she said there were some good things have come out of this, and one of the things that she said was good was the widespread use of telehealth now. That it was, basically they relaxed the rules on telehealth during the pandemic, and now they're going to be permanent. And that is, she thinks that is one way that you can address those disparities.
Can provide more access.
More access to health care to more people, and that is the key to fighting COVID-19 or any other disease.
But it is definitely true that the position it's left us in now, I mean, whether you think the changes that have happened are good, bad, or indifferent, it's undeniable that we have moved, because of COVID, here in Tennessee and in a lot of places around the country, we have aggressively moved public health out of the direct supervision and authority of health experts and under politicians. That's what we've done at the state level and at the county level now. The people who are going to make decisions, about the COVID pandemic going forward, but also about anything else that happens, the people actually with the authority to make decisions are no longer medical and health authorities. They are all elected officials
who are free to ignore the public health aspects of things, should they choose to do so. And that was one thing, and one of the things that Myers talked about. We didn't go into this in the article so much, but is that the big event in her estimation was when, at the very first of the pandemic, a lot of emphasis was placed on cleaning your hands, and they thought that personal touching would be a big driver of COVID. And then when they said nope, it's actually droplets from your
it's airborne
basically, and the public health community, as scientists do everywhere, when the facts change, or what they think are the facts change, then they pivot, and
Yep.
The public didn't pivot.
Yep.
And in fact, the public felt lied to, and that is, and that's kind of what she looked at as being kind of the root of this distrust in the public health system, and then the politicians taking the authority away from the public health system.
Yeah, and I think that it is interesting if you read sort of COVID skeptics, I guess, people who either think that the danger of the disease was overblown, or who think the public health measures were ineffective or unneeded or unwarranted. A lot of those arguments still will peg very much to specific things said and done in March and April of 2020, when, there were a lot of cautions and recommendations, and even initially, people like Fauci kind of downplaying the need for masks, which then they kind of pivoted a couple months later, say, no, actually, masks are good.
Yeah.
And there were, of course, you can look at that and say, well, we were dealing with a global pandemic and obviously potentially deadly virus, because it was quite literally killing lots of people. Like, that was the first thing we heard, is like Italian hospitals were overflowing, and they in fact were. Like, it actually was killing a lot of people. So people were responding and trying to figure things out on the fly. And also, like, this is how science and medicine works, right?
Yeah.
You go with the best information you have, but also you're constantly trying to get new information, and then ideally adjusting when that new information contradicts what you thought. But for a lot of people unaccustomed to, because we haven't gone through anything like this before. Nobody who's alive had been through anything like this. It felt past a point like, oh, they just keep changing everything. And in fact, if you go back and look, like there was a lot of flux in those first couple of months, and kind of from there on, the public health messaging got pretty consistent. Now there were some changes in, well, maybe it's safe to do this, maybe you don't have to worry about that, as we got more information. But really, there was a lot of consistency from relatively early on. So when people talk about how things keep changing, that's why they go back to those couple of months.
Right.
So it's like, well, yes, everything was changing. It was a brand new experience for everybody who was going through it. But the fact that we've now had we've had 3 years since then, almost 3 years since we got through those initial couple of months and settled into more of our, kind of pandemic management phase. Really, the guidance has been relatively consistent. Certainly once we got vaccines, that became a major part of what was recommended to people. It's been an interesting ride.
It has been, and it's one that has, been a huge driver of news. There's been so much about books could be written about just what happened in Knox County in the past 3 years. So it's a tough nut to crack, and we'll see going forward. It's been a year since we've had a surge,
right?
And the
numbers
Omicron,
have stayed pretty low.
Pretty low. The big number you follow now because of the prevalence of home testing, you don't really pay as much attention to case counts, but you look at hospitalizations, and they've been relatively flat for the last year, and
they're at a very low point right now.
They're at a very low point, so a lot of people have, and one thing that's going to convince people that maybe the pandemic is over is that the national health emergency is going to end in May 11th, and the Biden administration is going to let that lapse. That's going to do several things, but one of the things it's going to make getting tested and treated more expensive.
Right.
Again,
the feds aren't going to cover that anymore.
no, and again, that goes back to the disparities. That's going to mostly affect people who can't afford, and don't have insurance and can't afford the care, and but the pandemic is still here. It is. It's not over. It's a global, and one of the things that public health officials will want to do is say, remember, this is global. This isn't about just what's happening in Knox County, but it's global, and about 1,000 people are dying every day around the globe.
Worldwide,
Yeah.
And a few hundred in the U.S.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, at the United States, one of the highest per capita death counts in the world, certainly among quote-unquote developed countries. We're right up there. Tennessee, one of the highest death rates per capita. I haven't looked recently, but we'd been hanging around sort of 6th or 7th.
Yeah.
And most of the states that are in that top 10 it's mostly southern states. I think New Mexico it's southern states and poor states make up most of that top 10. And, it's interesting to me because I think if you listen to like our state leaders talk about COVID, they will champion that Tennessee's done a great job of handling this and of, not locking down as much as some other states did. Certainly true. That it's been good for the economy. Our economy has done pretty well. But it's interesting to have a state sort of declaring victory on something that actually, like, our numbers on are bad. Like, we're one of the worst states in the country for people dying from COVID. But people seem okay with that.
Yeah,
so,
more than 29,000 people Tennesseans have died in the last 3 years. So it's,
it's like the population of a small city.
Oh, absolutely. And, it's one of these things that, that I don't know how people can gloss over that. I mean, it's 29,000 people who should not have, granted, a lot of the people who died are or have been seniors.
Often people with some long-term health conditions.
So obviously nobody lives forever, but they did die sooner than they were. Than they were going to, for the most part. So
well, it's become the third leading cause of death in the United States.
Well, it's actually fallen.
Has it slipped down?
It got up to the number 3 as cause of death. It's slipped down out of the top 5 now, and but it still causes a lot of death.
Right. It's a cause of death that we didn't have a few years ago,
Right.
and I guess we will have for a good amount of time going forward. It's certainly affected. I mean, there was a period there where it was kind of literally all we were writing about, and like I think every reporter in the country, we got pretty tired of only writing about COVID.
Really?
It has been nice for really the last year. We still report the numbers when they come out week to week. We think it's good for people to know, but it's been nice for it not to be the focus, and I'll be very happy for it to continue. One thing I see sometimes out there is, the media just wants to hype this up so that they can talk about COVID. It's like, really, we would really rather talk about just about anything
else.
If these numbers just kind of stay low from now until forever, we will be among the very happy people because it hasn't been fun.
Well, one thing is, when the pandemic started, the health department would come out and they would update their numbers every day, and then it scaled back. Now they're doing it once a week. At some point, it would not surprise me that if they stopped reporting them on a weekly basis and go, I don't know what, that might happen in May when the state of emergency.
Or stop reporting them at all. There's nothing I know of that requires them to report.
No, and the they do report flu numbers, but not in real time,
Right.
and not.
It's kind of at the end of each flu season.
Yeah, and one thing, one of the things about the flu, it's a difference between the flu and COVID as far as health reporting goes. As mentioned earlier, there's a lot of home testing for COVID now. A lot of people are asymptomatic or not really sick, don't get tested, and don't get, there's no record of them having it. So the case count that we get is way lower than what the actual number of cases are. So and it's that way with the flu, because you only get the health officials find out about the flu when somebody gets treated in the hospital or their doctor and they get tested. Most people that I know don't bother getting tested. They just
Stay home
and live with the flu. And so one of the things they did though with the flu is, I believe it was, I want to say 2010, it might have been a little bit earlier than that. There's this huge survey done that the CDC did, and basically they figured out that if X number of people go to the hospital with the flu, then Y number of people also have it, but haven't been, it's not been reported. So they have this formula.
It's an estimate.
That is an estimate. Those are the flu numbers we get. We don't get, every case of flu accounted for.
It's also why those numbers are always round. They'll say there were 45,000 cases of flu this year. It's not 45,712 or whatever.
Right, and COVID reporting will probably end up being done along those lines. The one thing that COVID doesn't have is it doesn't have that survey. So they really don't know. You've got the people who've been tested. That's the X number, and the Y number, the people who aren't tested or tested at home, and all. They haven't had a survey to figure out that. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that happens in the next couple of years, and then we won't know about COVID until every 6 months or so. They'll say,
unless there's a big surge and suddenly the hospitals are full again and everybody's dying and whatever, and then we will write about that for sure. But of course, we all hope that doesn't happen. I just wanted to say, speaking of politics, because we were talking about sort of people on the Republican side maybe taking some political positions on this. You mentioned President Biden declaring the end of the health emergency. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that it's probably not a coincidence that that's happening in May, not too long before you would expect to see him starting to gear up his re-election campaign, assuming he is going to run for office again. I don't think that is he probably would not want to seek a second term with that still kind of lingering out there. So I don't think that is exactly a coincidence either. All right, well, now we are getting up toward our interview segment, and we sat down to talk with Rick Emmett. And Scott, you want to set this up a little bit?
Yeah, Rick Emmett is the city's downtown coordinator and has been for the last dozen years. He's the guy you go to if you live or own a business downtown, or a visitor downtown for that matter. But he's kind of the go-to guy. He gets things done. He's the fixer. So if you've got a problem with your the garbage pickup, or you have anything to do with parking, all kinds of things like that, you go to Rick. And Rick, who we both have known ever since we came here as journalists, Rick is retiring. So he's going to be by the end of the month. He will no longer be with the city. The city won't have an actual single downtown coordinator anymore. But we thought it would be interesting to sit down and talk with Rick about what it is that a downtown coordinator actually coordinates.
Yep, and some of the changes he's seen down there, and always a pleasure to talk to Rick, so let's go ahead and go to that.
Our guest this week is Rick Emmett, who is, for at least another couple of weeks, the downtown coordinator for the city of Knoxville. Rick is getting ready to retire, and we thought it would be a great time to get him on the podcast before he goes off and does his thing in retirement, and talk a little bit about downtown. Rick, welcome.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Jesse. Known both of you a long time.
Yeah, I should disclose right on the front end here that Rick and I were colleagues for about 7 years while I worked at the city, and we wrangled with a lot of these downtown issues together. There are things about that I don't miss, like setting downtown parking meter rates and things like that. But always enjoyed working with you.
There's always the minutia of downtown, as I like to call it, Jesse. As you heard many times, it's not the sexiest thing in the world, but it's what made it. It's what made it all work.
That's right.
Well, okay, Rick. Let's first of all, what does the downtown coordinator coordinate? Take us through your job.
Well, basically anything to do with downtown, I tried to get involved in, from special events to parking to garbage collection to, if the word downtown came in a conversation in a city department, I wanted to have some knowledge of it. So I sort of inserted myself into a lot of different departments because I wanted to know exactly how it was working. Because I got to ask those questions all the time, and I would observe things, that the departments aren't on the ground like I was, and they didn't really sometimes understand exactly what the situation was. So, anything to do with that. I mean, all the road closures we've had over the years. KUB spent probably a year or two with their Century project, tearing up the streets and replacing water and sewer lines all over town. All those road closures, trying to get those coordinated so you didn't have total chaos and gridlock downtown, which we had occasionally, even under the best circumstances. But that's basically it. Just waking up every day trying to make downtown better.
And why do you think downtown needed this position? I mean, I know this position was created originally under Bill Haslam when he was mayor, and it was kind of in those early days of downtown reinvestment. Why did the city need a coordinator specifically for the downtown area?
I think there's just so much going on, Jesse. It was hard for each department to keep up with it. They're based over at Elm Street, and so they weren't downtown every day. They weren't on the ground like we were out of the city county.
Like the engineering department, public service, all of those departments.
All those guys that did the work, they weren't really downtown. Folks would apply for a permit of some sort or another, and they would look at a map maybe and just kind of go from there. But you needed more than that. You got special events. You got things like businesses having deliveries, construction going on. Engineering wouldn't necessarily know that. They may get a building permit from inspections, but engineering wouldn't know that they're going to have a truck unloading something somewhere at a certain time. And so they'll issue a permit for road closure. Well, the truck can't even get there because of the road closure. I was telling Scott yesterday, Jesse, that's one of the first conversations I think you and I had when you had your boys trying to go down the middle of, I think it's a 400 block of Gay Street, and you end up having to be out in the middle of the road because both sidewalks were blocked at the same time.
Both sidewalks were completely closed, pointing to the other side.
Yeah. And so I'd only had the job for maybe a few months, and I think Jesse maybe called Bill, and Bill had him call me, and I was going, "What are you talking about?" I was working on the 100 block and other projects, hadn't really focused on that type of issue yet. But once I realized that was the situation, I jumped in there with engineering on all road closures, street closures, parking lane closures, everything they did. I wanted to make sure that I saw the application from that point on. So that was pretty good. We caught quite a lot of issues. We stopped a lot of issues from happening because of that. We've got really good guys now, though, I have to say, in engineering that are much more aware of those kinds of situations and on top of it than we had back in the day. We just have more people. But yeah, it was interesting. That's an example of some of the coordination issues you needed. And Jesse mentioned parking earlier. Parking's always a thing, parking meter rates or parking meters even working. We tried to go with these smart meters. They had sensors on them. That ended up being not the best idea in the world because the technology just wasn't there. The salesman, acted like it was all the rage and it would work. It never worked. It was, so we had to kind of get rid of all that technology that we had thought we were going to use as far as parking meters go. And frankly, you look on it now, as obviously had to get involved in parking a lot. The whole parking technology thing, eventually you're not even going to need a meter. You're going to have a QR code or something and have an app on your phone. I mean, that's where that whole thing's going one of these days. We did the 100 block and we came up with the newest technology at the time then, the multimeter. And so we put 2 multimeters on the 100 block, and those things cost a lot of money, but we thought, okay, we won't have all these meters, cluttering up the sidewalk all over the place. And they were solar powered and there was all this good stuff. But you got the Sturkey building there, those tall buildings, and the sun just didn't get in there, and the batteries went, and that didn't work like we wanted, obviously. So we had to move those. So it's been a learning curve, but it took somebody, I guess, like a position like mine was to support and promote those kinds of ideas. And I had a little bit of budget that the city had given me every year to help with these newer ideas, and that was pretty important too, I thought.
Yeah, and people, even with parking downtown is so unique in many ways, because you try to accommodate so many things like delivery vehicles. You have food trucks. Now you've got the scooters. Juggling all those things has to be a big challenge. And what are some of the other big challenges downtown faces that maybe other areas of the city don't?
Well, parking is probably one of the bigger ones we've already talked about. But parking, most areas of Knoxville don't have these parking situations that we have. I mean, we've added on to the parking garages, which was huge. Since I've worked for the city, we actually added the Market Square garage, Locust Street garage. The Langley garage was constructed. We added on State Street garage, and we still have waiting lists for parking downtown. And I've told a lot of people now that got involved in parking, people want certainty in parking. They want to know if they come downtown, what it's going to cost and where they can park. And if they ever get down there and they get a ticket in some way, they're mad at the city forever. It ruins that whole experience. That's my feeling when I go to another city as well. So I've always tried to make sure we had some certainty in parking. The parking garages, we added sensors in there so you can actually go to an app and you can see if there's parking spaces in our garages before you get there. Thought that was a pretty cool thing to do. The other issues are just living downtown, you have noise issues, you have all the big city, even though it's like Mayberry downtown in a lot of ways, you still have noise and you still have, vagrancy, and you still have trash smells and things like that you don't have in other parts of the
people
city.
Cleaning up after their dogs or failing to.
Yeah, that's still an issue, Jesse. It's been one for years. Sometimes we'll get it in a pretty good place, but it seems like for whatever reason the last few months I've heard that more than I've heard for a couple of years, I guess. And I don't know if it's just new people coming downtown, or a lot of times we blamed it on new students. Students would come down and they're from somewhere and they bring a big dog and don't really, I guess, understand the rules around that. But what happens is all the fellow dog owners end up policing that situation. A lot of times they'll see somebody doing something and jump on them, and so it sort of self corrects, I think, as it goes on. But yeah, those are still issues you don't typically have out in the burbs.
Well, and I think that, a lot of what you're talking about are the pressures that come from having this mixed use area, which is like a 24-hour, during the day, it's a business district. And then in the evenings, it's a really all around the clock, it's a residential district, but especially in the evenings. And then on weekends, it's a recreational district where everybody comes to. So given that the city has kind of tried to push that encourage that mixed use model in other areas, has downtown been kind of a training ground to learn how to, instead of having these kind of the single use zoning, which is what we have in most parts of the city, understand what it takes to have an area where you have lots of uses kind of overlapping?
I think you're exactly right, Jesse. And that's what I expect the old city is going to experience. They're already sort of getting there from just being the bar area. You got a lot of residents down there with baseball coming. I think that's exactly what's going to happen there. The Regis, the North area, Sevier Avenue area, even Cumberland, all those areas I think are going the lessons we learned downtown, I think you're going to have to export over to those areas as well, and worry about, garbage pickup and all the things you didn't really have to worry about as much. And I think the city will do that. I think that the guys that are there now, and not because of me, but I have pestered them enough over the last few years over these things that I think now when something gets started, they sort of start thinking maybe a little bit with a broader view than maybe they had to begin with. So I hope so.
One thing you mentioned just a few minutes ago was downtown is like Mayberry in a lot of ways, and Mayberry isn't the comparison that automatically leaps to mind. But I do know that when I've been with you downtown before, when you're out walking around, people just come up to you and start asking you questions and getting advice, and it really is like a neighborhood.
Yeah, it was crazy yesterday when I saw you, Scott. The 4 hours I was down there, I bet I had 20 conversations with people about everything in the world, from can I serve liquor? Can I sell liquor here? Can I have an encroachment there? Can I park here? Can I use my window for this purpose? I mean, just all this conversations you have, and it's all people I know very well now. There's so many people down there that, and I feel like they're all friends. It's kind of like us all sitting around the table somewhere. It's just the kind of conversation that comes up, and if you know something and I have a question about it, I'll ask you. That's sort of the way it is.
One of the most persistent issues downtown, and not only downtown, but obviously, is homelessness, and specifically really panhandling, recognizing that not all panhandlers are necessarily homeless and vice versa. But I guess, how have you seen that issue evolve in the time that you've been in the job? And, what's the answer to that? I still definitely hear complaints about it from business owners, from residents and visitors alike, but also understanding that there are a lot of people who don't necessarily have, other great options.
Well, it's been a problem the entire time I've worked for the city, Jesse. Even before I was downtown coordinator, we've always walked around downtown. Frankly, some of the people that were panhandling 10, 12 years ago are still down there panhandling, unfortunately. And so I don't know, I think I think the police department's done a better job here the last year or so. I think they put more focus on that, not to arrest people, but to inform them of the rules around panhandling. Because some of them are newer folks that just come to town and they've, I get it. Frankly, I told Scott yesterday, a lot of these folks I've come to know because it is Mayberry and I know everybody down there. A lot of them have a place they're not homeless. They've got a place to live. They're in some low income housing unit place around town. They'll take the trolley into town and they'll sit around down there and party all day. And sometimes they run out of money, and sometimes they'll start asking people for funds and that's what'll end up happening. So it's a complicated thing, and a lot of them are drug addicted, a lot of mental illness downtown, and those people usually don't panhandle very much. They may, but it's a complicated thing. I know all cities have it. We just do our best to try to warn folks. There's a better way to give, and we put up some signage, and we've tried all kinds of ways over the years to try to make people feel like that it's not terribly threatening. Usually it's, the threatening behavior usually doesn't happen down there, but it is awkward, if nothing else, to be asked, and sometimes repeatedly, for money. Like I said, they know me, so they don't ask me very much anymore. Most of them, they may start in until they see who I am, they'll turn their head and go the other way. That's what you really have to do. Just be persistent and say no and keep walking. But it's an issue. It's an issue all over the city, not just downtown these days too. I hear folks over at West Town Mall, for instance, have the same issue, and that on Merchants Road now. So I don't know if they've left downtown, some of them, and they've gone to those areas, or it's just opportunity or what the situation is. But that's a tough one.
Well, now you worked for the city 31, 32 years. The last dozen have been as downtown coordinator, but you also did some other stuff before. One of the things that I most associate with you as a journalist is your work on the census and redistricting, and you've done that every time redistricting's been done since you've been at the city. What was that kind of like? So.
Well, that was always interesting. It was more involved, I think, than a lot of people realize, because the census, we have the census count, every 10 years, but we start talking about the census 3 or 4 years in advance, trying to get all the addresses correct, and then we start trying to figure out how we're going to promote the census and all that kind of thing. And then every year we have something called the boundary annexation survey that we have to submit. If we've done any annexations, for instance, we have to turn those in to get it counted. So there's a little bit to do a lot of the time, not a lot all at once until it's the year of, but there's always some activity going on around the census, pretty much year round. But it's important. I mean, that's how we get grant money. That's what I learned the first, few years I was working for the city, because I was a technical services administrator and I was involved in annexations and things, but we kept the population count down there too, because we kept up with dwelling units. And so, it was quite often I would get a phone call from the police department or fire department who were applying for some grant, and there was a population estimate as part of that. And so that's when I started realizing it's pretty important to make sure we have a good count and an accurate count. So didn't know anything about it until I came to the city, but I learned pretty quickly, because Mayor Ash, was pretty good about getting me involved in things like that. Because there's a mapping exercise in a lot of ways, and I was involved in mapping. So that's really how I got involved in the census stuff years ago.
Well, and of course, redistricting itself is very important. It's one of the most important, parts of government and democracy is getting that right.
Yeah, the first redistricting I got involved in was complicated, because we didn't really have the computer technology and software that we have today. So it's pretty much taking a map and with a count of the census blocks and a calculator and trying to say, all right, if we move this here, what'll happen, and how do we balance all this out? And and it was a little political. These things can be somewhat political, but not terribly so. But it was interesting to get that to balance, and then to try to explain it to city council members what you're doing and why you're doing it that way. And back in the day, as you remember, Scott, you had Carlene Malone was there, and others, Jack Sharp and others on city council, and they were pretty knowledgeable about all of it, but they wanted to understand, why did you come to this conclusion? Why did you do it this way? So I can remember having at least a couple of public meetings on that, and luckily Carlene liked the plan that we adopted or proposed, and she was a big champion of it, thank goodness, in the year 2000, so, or 1999, I guess, when we proposed it. So it was interesting to go, because you didn't really know till you got the census numbers how much change you're going to have to. There may be somewhere, and people hate change, as we all know. And if you're changing people's voting patterns and where they have to go vote, they're not going to be too happy. So, it was kind of a tricky thing to try to not offend any more people than we had to, I suppose.
So, turning back to downtown, kind of thinking about the big picture. I'll give you a chance to brag on, if not yourself, the city. Most of what's happened downtown has been driven by private investment, private developers, obviously. But how important, in your view, has the city's role been in helping make that happen? Kind of tilling the soil a little bit. And then I guess a lot of what you've been doing is sort of like nurturing that along the edges as it's continued to grow.
I think that's been pretty huge, Jesse, to have someone in government that's a cheerleader for development and trying to, and not doing anything wrong in any way, but letting those guys know we appreciate the fact that you're taking a huge risk, which they are, to come down here. And yes, they had tip and pilot, a lot of them did, But even with that, there's a huge risk involved, and you're renovating an older building. You don't know what you're getting into. And yeah, you may have a tip or a pilot, and you've done some architectural work, but until you really get in there and start trying to do that renovation, you don't really know what you've gotten into. And it's so many times it would happen where, one of the developers downtown would call me somewhere along the line, and they've got some big issue that they need the fire marshal or inspection or something that's going to need it pretty quickly. Something unusual has happened. They're going to have to kind of change what they're doing. And but just having somebody that they could call and would listen, and which I tried to do, and try to link them up with the right person if I didn't know myself. I think that was pretty big. I think the folks that were developing downtown, and even newer folks, the fact that they know that the city and the administration, are behind them. It's not just the no team, as we used to joke about, Jesse, when you were there. It's not just the no team. There are some yes people over there too at the city. So I think that's what we've tried to do, or I've tried to do. And of course, a lot of credit goes to Bill Lyons. Bill is your boss and mine. I think when I was there, and Bill, is my friend, mentor, smart guy. I've known Bill the entire time I've been at the city of Knoxville, and huge promoter of downtown. And so, Bill, I always felt like, and I did have the mayor's back and the backing of the deputy directors. And so I could probably get some things done maybe the others couldn't a little bit, because when I came to a department to say I've got a problem, they would have to listen. They would usually act on it pretty quickly, and not to be mean to them or anything. I wasn't, but I knew they would have an answer, and they all of them would jump on it pretty quickly. And a lot of times it was just the fact they didn't know exactly what the situation was. And they've got a ton of things to do. There's no doubt about it. They've got 100 square miles to deal with, not just every little couple, 3 square miles of downtown, And I appreciated it. I knew that too. So, but I think it's been pretty important to have that coordination and that extra person on the ground that could help, be a liaison or a concierge, or whatever you want to call it, between developers and the city. And I have to say, my engineering background, I was in engineering for probably 14 years when I got hired by the city, was very helpful, because I could understand, the construction issues and the details, and I didn't have to. I could talk to the guy that was running the backhoe downtown and understand what he's trying to do, and I think that was pretty helpful to be able to get them to explain the exact situation and the exact problem they've got, and then we can be creative sometimes in our solutions too when that happens. So.
I remember some creative solutions. There's one I'm thinking of involving a highway sign that I'm not sure the statute of limitations has run out on, so we won't talk about all this. But I know there were times you had to take things into your own hands.
Yeah, Jesse, talking about smart fix and all those crazy signs that were up everywhere, half of them pointing the wrong direction, and they were up for years after smart fix was over, and so confusing, and they looked terrible, but it wasn't city signs, it was somebody else's. So we had to kind of take the bull by the horns, and had to kind of make sure that situation got corrected in some way.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of experiences like that around town, of things that we've observed, and they're just it's not clear cut who's responsible or who's supposed to do something or another, and you can spend a lot of time trying to figure that out and explain it to somebody else, and then they have to figure out who in their shop might do something, or you can just go ahead and do it. so that's sometimes, and I've been fortunate. I've got a lot of guys that I work with in the city that are willing to help me when I had a issue, and they would help me find a solution.
Well, all right. So you are, you have a couple more weeks, I guess, and then you're off to retirement. So what are your plans? What are you going to be doing afterwards?
Well, I don't know. I'm gonna try to take it easy for a little while and kind of see where life takes me. I may have another minor career in me. I don't know if I do or not, but I've talked about consulting maybe with some people. I like to garden. I like to play guitar. I like to travel. We like to hike. My family it's important to me. My mother and father are still alive. They're in Eastern Kentucky, and so I hope to spend more time up there than I've been able to spend in Middlesboro. So, I think I'll find a way to keep myself busy. I read. I like to write. I mean, I think I've got lots of hobbies that I can occupy my time with.
Are you still going to come and hang out downtown?
Well, I am, Jesse. That's exactly what I hope to do. But again, like I said yesterday, was a pretty good example of that. If, when I'm downtown, everybody wants to talk about, all the issues with the city, which is good. But I'm not going to be able to. I guess I'll have to call 311 or something.
Right.
Heck, I don't know. I've already warned all the guys. I'm probably going to call you if something goes on that needs fixing.
People are still going to be asking you.
They are. And I'm probably still going to call the guys I know that do the work. I've already told them I may call Russ, but I'm probably going to call you too, just because. I mean, I've spent too much time down there. We've all put too much effort into making it work, and I'm not just going to abandon everything down there. If I see something that I think I have a thought about, I'm going to find somebody, and maybe a deputy to the mayor. They've all been very gracious and said, call me anytime and let's talk and let's get a beer or whatever. And I said, sure, we'll do that for sure. So yeah, I'm not going to abandon downtown. And all the events, I'll actually have more time, I think, to go to Tennessee Theater and Bijou and, all the various festivals and things than I do now. So I'm hoping to take advantage of all the activities downtown as much as I can.
All right. Well, that's probably a good place to wrap up. So Rick, thanks a lot for joining us, and best wishes with the next chapter.
Thank you guys, appreciate it.
That's right.
And thanks again to Rick for talking with us. He mentioned in that interview that he plays guitar, and one thing I think is worth noting, when I worked at the city, Rick was famous for writing song parodies about city government, where he would kind of take some existing song and write new lyrics to it. He would perform these at private gatherings where city people were getting together. Some of them were pretty funny.
And now you can do it in public.
That's right. You can just put those out on YouTube.
Yeah, no repercussions once you're retired.
I've got a producer that can help him with that. Tell him to give me a call.
Yeah, all right. We'll tell him to get in touch with you, Seth. Okay, we are to the reader question portion of the podcast. Every week we invite readers on our subscriber-only Facebook page, The Compass Colloquy, to tell us anything they would like to hear about on the podcast. And this week we got a question which is yet again about state government, because again, state government is where most of the civic action is happening right now. And so this question was about a proposal to disband something called the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth, which is an interesting issue. It does not have it's not a local issue, except in the sense that anything that affects state government also affects obviously what goes on here in Knox County. But basically what has happened, so there's an independent body called the Tennessee Commission on Children and Youth, which was established, I think, about 35 years ago.
Right, 35 years ago. 21 members.
Yep. Appointed by the state legislature and the governor.
Right.
And they're there to kind of provide, because there are so many parts of state government that deal with the well-being of Tennessee children. Obviously, the Department of Education, of course, the Department of Children's Services, which we talk about a lot, the judicial system, I mean, children encounter state government and state government encounters children in lots of different ways. And what this commission does is kind of serve as an umbrella. They're not exactly an agency. They're an independent commission, and they just kind of review how all of those parts of state government are doing in their interactions with Tennessee youth, right?
Yeah, and what happened recently is they issued a report, a scathing report about the foster care system.
Through the Department of Children's Services.
Right, through the Department of Children's Services. Talked about how it's the worst foster care program in the country. Mm-hmm. That apparently did not sit well with the powers that be, and now Governor Lee is wanting to disband
And that's the interesting thing about this so far. I mean, you say that apparently didn't sit well. We don't actually know that because so far, Governor Lee has basically refused to answer questions about why he has proposed disbanding this group.
Right.
It was to be heard in a committee session this past week, and there was a fair amount of, first of all, there was pushback from child advocates from across the state who find this commission very important and think that it's valuable to have, and that this report about Department of Children's Services and foster care was exactly the kind of thing that it's supposed to be doing,
Right.
is saying, hey, here's an area where the state is not doing a good job in serving this population. But Lee hasn't said why he wants to make this change. House Majority Leader William Lamberth, who's carrying the bill for the governor, has only said, basically he said, well, the governor asked me to, first of all. And secondly, well, we just want to look and make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to do. Very vague. No sense of what they think it's not doing that it's supposed to do, or what it's doing that they would prefer it not to do. Basically, they just haven't given any explanation. They've just said, well, we think that these needs can be served other places, including in the Department of Children's Services, that they would kind of move that ombudsman role, that oversight role, into the Department of Children's Services. So instead of having an outside commission that has some supervisory or at least can make reports and recommendations, that all that would be done internally in a department that basically everybody agrees isn't doing what it needs to do right now.
No, well, the Department of Children's Services has just been, it's been a mess for a long time.
A long time.
And
multiple administrations.
And nobody's been able to fix it for whatever reason. One of the and, you know, they've got children in state custody sleeping in offices in Memphis.
Yep.
So it's you know, it's one of the things is, you're talking about the $1 billion plus for from federal that would be going to replace the federal education funding. Well, that's not a bad. This wouldn't be a bad place to park that $1 billion, dollars.
Right.
So to get them to increase the number of employees, to increase the number of children that they can adequately care for, and so. But I think that this was a case of just shooting the messenger.
It feels that way, and certainly in the absence of any compelling explanation being offered,
Right.
That's kind of what you're left with. And I think it's interesting because I think if you add this to, say, this measure that was just taken against Nashville, cutting their Metro Council in half, which, as we said, was very much perceived as being a direct response to them not inviting the Republican National Committee to have their convention here, it starts to feel like a pattern of really retaliation from the top levels of state government, from, in this case, the governor's office, in that case with Nashville, the legislature. But as we move into Bill Lee's second term, it's interesting to watch this and see if this is going to be a pattern. Lee has been close with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. He's made a couple of trips down to Florida as DeSantis's guest, and DeSantis, as we know, has built himself up a national reputation as a governor and is a theoretical contender for the Republican nomination next year, although he hasn't declared yet. But a hallmark of his approach to state government in Florida has been exactly this kind of really explicit retaliatory, like slash and burn politics. If you get on the wrong side of me on an issue, like, I'm going to come after you with everything I can. I'm going to defund your department. I'm going to pass laws against you. Like, that has become a part of kind of DeSantis's political persona. And I just can't help wondering a little bit if, Governor Lee has seen that as something he admires, or maybe a viable path to some other kind of visibility or whatever. But It does. It feels very retaliatory, and you just kind of wonder if this is a direction beyond what happens with this commission, which, there has been a lot of pushback on it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of questions, including from Republican legislators, about it. So we'll see what happens with it. But just the move in the first place, what kind of message does this send to any other state body or agency that might release a report that the governor's office doesn't like? I mean, it's not too hard to read into it.
I know. I mean, it would definitely make a lot of people in state government think twice.
Yeah.
About speaking up, and even through. And this isn't whistleblowing. This is just what you do.
Yeah, this was actually they're literally doing the job that they were supposed to do, and nobody that I'm aware of challenged that report's accuracy. Nobody said, "Oh no, you're being unfair to our foster system or our Department of Children's Services." It wasn't, or some sense that they had some other agenda or whatever. Nobody has said that at all. It's just that now the governor has come out and said he wants to get rid of the commission altogether. Right. So that's what we know about that. We'll certainly continue to follow it and see what happens there. All right, let's look ahead to this coming week. We do have spring break is over. All of our local government officials and everybody else should be getting back into the office from their Caribbean or Mediterranean vacations or wherever they all went. So we do have a couple of things happening. County Commission is holding its monthly work session Monday at 5 p.m. in the main assembly room of the City County building. A couple of things on the agenda that are potentially interesting. One is, as we have talked about, Commissioner Daisha Lundy has a resolution seeking to subpoena representatives of the Sheriff's Office to talk about this incident at McAllister's Deli back in November, which we've talked about a lot. She needs 2/3 of county commissioners to agree to issue those subpoenas. I think she has always believed that would be difficult to achieve, but she clearly wants to have at least conversation about it and about the appropriateness of the sheriff's response in this situation, both to the incident at McAllister's, but also then to her own efforts to try to get information about it, because the Sheriff Tom Spangler has been, I think we could say, curt. One might even say a little dismissive toward Commissioner Lundy's efforts to get information about this. I don't know what other commissioners think about that response, but we may hear some discussion about that. There's also a proposal to try to do a better job of enforcing required improvements by developers. So a lot of times when development proposals come through Planning Commission and through County Commission, they have conditions attached to them that the developer agrees to do some sort of infrastructure improvements in order to facilitate the development. What County Commission has found is that when a developer doesn't do that, their options are sometimes kind of limited. And most recently, County Commission had to spend county money to make some road improvements at a development that the developer was supposed to do and didn't do. And they don't, I mean, there's a bond amount that developers put up that the county can take, but then beyond that, if it costs more than that or to do the actual work, et cetera, their legal options are a little limited. So this proposal would kind of consolidate the oversight of those with the county Department of Engineering and Public Works, and would withhold final approval of a project until they were satisfied that work was going to be done. Because what they don't want to do is be in a position where they're signing off on developments with the understanding that certain improvements are going to be made, and then having to come back 3 years later and spend county money to go and do the improvements that the developer did. So we'll see what comes out of that. And then City Council is meeting on Tuesday.
Yeah, the council's meeting at 6 o'clock on Tuesday in the main assembly room of the City County building. And a couple of things on the agenda that are kind of interesting. One is appropriating $1 million, essentially, a little bit more, for the build out of the real-time crime center in the new public safety complex. What that center does is it's new. KPD's never had one. But these types of centers, it's basically a nerve center, and where various video feeds from camera networks all over the city, some of them owned by the public, some of them privately owned. They contract with the owner, and those feeds come in and show up in real time on multiple screens, and police officers there can watch and actually see crimes being committed, can get units dispatched necessary. They also obviously already have video that they can use to later identify people as well, and use in court proceedings. But these are they're looking at putting in a network of these cameras up in the city, on city streets. They're also going to use, they're talking about using KCDC video feeds from public housing projects that they manage. There's also other private companies could do that if they, for instance, one of the big places for car break-ins is Westtown Mall. Mm-hmm. And if Westtown would agree, or if they come to an agreement with the city, if the city so chose, they could get the feed from there and be able to identify when things happen there. So anyway, this is, as I said, about $1 million project to do. It's already been budgeted, so it's not like they're having to deep into savings to get it. But that will go, and they're really winding down now the construction there at the public safety complex. At some point this spring, it'll probably be open enough for them to do a ribbon cutting. We'll see. Another thing that this is a kind of a curious matter that's coming up. Councilwoman Amelia Parker, who is an at-large council member, is pushing for a 90-day moratorium on building permits issued in all zones in the South Waterfront. And basically, she's wanting to do that because council has talked about, and they're going to have a workshop on the South Waterfront Code, because some developers have to get so many variances to get something done that you might, a lot of people think that the code's meaningless. And so now we're going to get together and talk about plans approvals under the code. Others have that's what Tommy Smith, who represents South Waterfront, wants. Others want a more expansive view of the whole code and maybe make major changes to it. Parker's one of those. But it's interesting that the this idea of a moratorium, and it's a little unclear, but I mean, you have to get building permits for a lot of stuff. If you want to put a deck on the back of your house, there's some circumstances where you don't need one, but for the most part, yeah, you've got to do that. If you want to put carport on your driveway, you got to get a building permit to do that. So there are all kinds of things that it's not just big developments, and this would affect all of the zones in the South Waterfront, including the single-family housing zones. So I'm not sure how that would work, but she's proposed it. This isn't something that came from the mayor's office, and so we'll see on Tuesday if that sort of thing will be able to pass.
Interesting. All right. Well, if that happens, or anything else that happens next week, we will be back next week to talk about. I think that does it for today. A long one today, but that legislature, there's a lot going on in Nashville. We will probably have some more about that to talk about next week as well. For now, thanks to Seth Barber here at Barber Productions for his work behind the controls. Our theme music is by Will Wright, and we will see you next week.
Welcome to Compass Points, the weekly podcast for CompassKnox.com. CompassKnox.com is your best source for news and politics in Knoxville and Knox County. Your hosts today are Scott Barker and Jesse Mayshark, the founders of CompassKnox.com. You can find their daily in-depth coverage and subscribe at CompassKnox.com. The Compass Point podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Almost an Agreement. Almost an Agreement is a layman's attempt to get a handle on the workings in government and politics that we deal with every day. Check them out at almostanagreement.com or subscribe for free on your favorite podcast provider. If you'd like to learn more about the topics discussed on today's podcast, go to CompassKnox.com and subscribe for in-depth coverage and much more. And many thanks to William Wright for composing our theme song. Compass Points is a partnership of Barking Shark Media and Barbarian Productions, and recorded by Lord Seth A. Barber at Barbarian Studios, Knoxville, Tennessee.